reducing waiting lists in Wales.
Geraint Davies.
Yeah, the Secretary of State will be aware that higher levels of poverty give rise to higher cost of healthcare and higher absolute numbers of people needing healthcare. So how can he justify the fact that Wales doesn't get its 5% share of HS2, £5 billion, and is losing enormous amounts of money from EU funding that he promised would be provided, and thousands of jobs in Welsh universities? We need that productivity to alleviate poverty, to put less pressure on the NHS. It's his fault that those waiting lists are growing.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I certainly don't recognise the figures he's come up with on HS2. The fact of the matter is that the UK government has replaced EU funding in full through the Shared Prosperity Scheme and the Community Ownership Fund, the Community Renewable Fund, Levelling Up Funds and much else besides. And the UK government has also made certain that £1.20 is delivered per head of population for NHS care in Wales, as opposed to £1 in England. It's very hard for the honourable gentleman to explain why it is that Wales receives more money to deliver healthcare and yet delivers lower standards.
Justin Oswald.
Speaker, if the UK government were to uplift NHS and social care pay in England to the level in Scotland, it would unlock funding for all the devolved nations to support their national health services through the cost of living crisis. Will the Secretary of State discuss the possibility of a pay uplift and its impact on Wales with Cabinet colleagues?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, the honourable lady is right that Scotland is very generously funded. She seems to be making an argument that perhaps Wales and England should receive more money per head than Scotland does at the moment, and that she'd be happy with that. I doubt it very much. But, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that despite the generous funding that the honourable lady and her government receives, they have also very, very poor health outcomes, and some of their own members have said the healthcare in Scotland is close to collapse.
Jeff Smith. Question 3, Mr. Speaker. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 3 and 4 together. The UK Government is committed to supporting renewable energy generation in Wales, including for innovative tidal stream technologies at Morlais through our flagship Contracts for Difference scheme. I will continue to work across government to ensure we can capitalise on the huge renewable energy opportunities Wales has to offer.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The best way to bring down bills for Welsh businesses long term is to help transition away from fossil fuels. That's why Labour is calling for a national wealth fund so we can help industries like Welsh Steel win the race of the future. What comparable steps is the government going to do to help heavy industry decarbonise?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has an ambitious programme to decarbonise this country by 2050, and we have provided £21.5 million to the South Wales Industrial Cluster to decarbonise heavy industry and support the transition to net zero. And of course, the opportunities for floating offshore wind in that region could be critical too.
Liz Twist.
Mr. Speaker, a Labour government will more than quadruple offshore wind to make the UK a clean energy superpower, making the most of the fantastic natural resources in Wales. When will his government match that ambition so that sectors like Welsh offshore wind can achieve their full potential?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned in the previous question, there is an ambitious programme for offshore wind, including floating offshore wind in South West Wales and South West England. There is an intention for 4 gigawatts of power to be provided through the Celtic Sea by 2035, and many more gigawatts into the future.
Committee, Stephen Crabb.
Mr. Speaker, and on this St David's Day, there's lots of reasons to be positive about the Welsh economy, not least the role that Wales will play in delivering greater energy security for the UK and helping move us to net zero. So on that theme, Mr. Speaker, would the Minister agree with me? We have a brilliant opportunity with deploying floating offshore wind in the Celtic Sea, but we do need the government to go ahead and give us the Celtic free port for South Wales, and a huge opportunity on Ynys Môn with developing new gigawatt-scale nuclear power.
Well, my right honourable friend is once again a strong campaigner on this front, and I'd also like to add, of course, that there's £60 million being invested in Pembroke Dock in the marine project through the Swansea Bay City deal. So there's plenty of potential for his region.
Sir Oliver Hill.
To agree with me that over recent months we've seen better cooperation between the European Union and the UK over energy. And does he agree with me that the Windsor Framework will mean that we can go much further? It will release the potential to have energy security and also the prices hopefully come down as a result of that sort of cooperation, which will help Wales.
Minister.
He's right, of course, that cooperation is always a good thing, and in fact, interconnectors are critical to our energy security. I met only last week a company proposing to connect mainland Great Britain with the Republic of Ireland over the second interconnector.
Shadow Minister Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know oil and gas producers have been making record profits for more than 18 months, but his government's paltry windfall tax began in May last year. So can I ask the Minister how his government can justify leaving billions of excess profits untouched while so many people across Wales are struggling with household bills and the rising cost of living crisis?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, mercifully, energy costs do appear now to be on a downward trajectory, but he'll be aware that there's been up to 70% tax taken off energy producers through windfall tax, which is bringing a great deal of money into the Treasury to help to fund the support packages that people are relying on.
5, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I share the concerns of everyone in the House about the grave allegations of misogyny that have been made about the Welsh Rugby Union, and the recent contract negotiations with players has also been a matter of concern. Rugby has always been at the heart of Welsh culture, and as such I was pleased to meet with the acting Chief Executive Officer, Nigel Walker, recently. He is an honourable man and very well thought of, and I'm sure he takes these allegations seriously and will be dealing with them.
Dr. Luke Evans.
And half English. The game at the weekend can often be difficult, but one thing that unites it is being a rugby fan. Now, here in England, I've met with the CEO of the Premiership Rugby, the CEO of the RFU, and the Minister to ensure good governance. What conversations has he had with Welsh-led Labour government to ensure that players, the fans, and good governance secure rugby union at its elite start in Wales?
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously sport is a devolved matter, but I have had conversations not only with Nigel Walker, but also with other members of the WRU in an informal way. The UK government, and I'm sure the Welsh government, were appalled by these allegations, and I would be happy to work with Welsh government, the WRU, or any other body, including the external body that's been set up to look at this, in order to ensure that these are properly dealt with.
Anna McMorran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and dydd Gwyl Dewi Sant hapus. And I'm sure everybody is concerned by these allegations of discrimination and misogyny within the WRU that victims have come forward and said they have faced. Can I ask the Secretary of State what conversations he's having with his own colleagues in DCMS about this very matter, and what pressure they can then put on the WRU to address these very serious allegations?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady will be aware that the sport is a devolved matter, but I can only say to her that those concerns will be shared in DCMS, and these sorts of allegations haven't just been made about rugby, they have been made about other sports as well. So I think there is a nationwide problem. I know my colleagues in the DCMS will be doing everything that they can to deal with allegations like this in England, and I can honestly say to her I would be very happy to work with her, with the WRU, with Welsh Government, or any other body that has some means of dealing with this. We must absolutely make sure that sport is safe for women, safe for minorities, safe for everyone to take part in without any form of discrimination.
Simon Baines.
Number 6, please, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 6 and 11 together. I have regular discussions with ministerial colleagues about how the £330 million allocated to Wales so far through Levelling Up funds is supporting communities, creating jobs, driving up economic growth, and keeping this government's commitment to ensure that Wales does not lose a penny as a result of coming out of the European Union.
Simon Baines.
Mr. Speaker, the Labour Welsh Government has let down Clwyd South and Wrexham very badly by scrapping the A483 junction upgrade, which would have unlocked substantial investment and jobs in our community. Would my right honourable friend agree that the Welsh Government needs to support and maximise the benefits of the UK Government's Welsh Levelling Up Fund projects by investing in road upgrades across Wales?
Mr. Speaker, I think my honourable friend makes an excellent point. The Welsh Government's response to the road review gives the impression that Wales is closed for business by determining that no further road building projects will take place. I urge the Welsh Government to consider what the impact is on the economy of not building roads and what is going to be the impact on the long-term prosperity of Wales, and consider how they might build on the record of support that Wales has received through levelling up funds and city and growth deals by rebuilding roads and improving connectivity across Wales.
Alan Kearns.
Mr Clywyd, dydd Gwyl Dewi hapus. The Levelling Up Fund offered the prospects for communities that have been ignored by the Welsh Labour Government for many, many years. Barry is such a community. But during the last Levelling Up Fund application, Cardiff Bay, that has received billions of pounds in regenerations over recent decades, received a further £50 million in Levelling Up funding, but Barry, making waves, which is delivering a marina for project, was ignored. What hope and prospect and opportunity can I offer people in Barry for the next round of Levelling Up funding?
Well, Mr Speaker, I fully understand my right honourable friend's disappointment that the bid was not successful on this occasion, and I pay tribute to him for being such a champion for that particular bid and for his own constituency. And I would suggest to him that there is going to be a third round of Levelling Up funding, and I hope that local authorities that have not thus far been successful will apply in round 3 of Levelling Up.
Windsor.
Dydd Gwyl Dewi hapus I bawb. Will the Minister please join me in congratulating Mountain Ash in my constituent Cynon Valley for being shortlisted for the Let's Celebrate Towns competition, which has been announced here in Parliament this evening. But on this St David's Day, will he also now join me in urging UK Government to restore the £1.1 billion missing in Wales and allow Welsh Government to administer those funds to enable every community in Wales, including Cynon Valley, to thrive?
Well, first of all, Mr Speaker, I'd like to say llongyfarchiadau iawn to the constituents of the Honourable Lady. As far as the figure that she's just quoted, I don't recognise that. The UK Government has made sure that record funding has flowed through to Welsh Government, and in replacing the funds that we used to receive from the European Union, we've made sure that Wales has not lost out by one penny, and the UK Government has been working directly with the 22 local authorities across Wales, including hers, to ensure that we can continue to deliver jobs and prosperity and growth in Wales.
Dugan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister says he doesn't recognise the £1.1 billion. Well, the people and communities of Wales will recognise the £1.1 billion when it fails to materialise any significant improvement in their communities in healthcare outcomes or in business investment. What will he do to compensate the people of Wales for the paltry Levelling Up funding that is no match for European funding?
Mr Speaker. The honourable gentleman will know perfectly well that it isn't just Levelling Up funding that is replacing EU funds. It's Levelling Up funds, community ownership funds, community renewal funds, shared prosperity funds, and on top of that, the government is delivering nearly £790 million in growth deals. Wales has not lost out by one penny as a result of the UK Government implementing the result of the referendum in which the people of Wales voted to leave the European Union.
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, this government has provided an unprecedented package for non-domestic energy users through this winter worth £18 billion. And our new energy bills discount scheme will provide a discount on high energy costs to give businesses certainty whilst limiting taxpayers' exposure to volatile energy markets.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I do welcome the Secretary of State's support running up to April, but he must accept that the changes that the government are introducing from April is also bringing about huge amounts of uncertainty for many businesses, including my Ogmore constituency. There's one particular business that is looking at potentially making several hundred of their workforce redundant because they're unable to get some guarantees on funding for their business beyond April. Will the Secretary of State agree to meet with me to see what work we can do to try and ensure this business is secured and convince the Chancellor that more support is needed for businesses in Wales and across the UK in the budget?
Well, Mr Speaker, I certainly know the Chancellor and the Treasury have been having discussions with businesses in Wales about what support can be given, but I would be perfectly happy to meet with the honourable gentleman and the business in his constituency to see what further support can be given to them.
Virginia Crosby.
Businesses on Honest Morn have been impacted by the cost of living crisis, compounded by lack of investment in key infrastructure. With the cancellation of plans for a third Menai Bridge, it's clear that Labour and their Plaid chums in Cardiff would rather Anglesey be on a road to nowhere. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that a free port on Anglesey would demonstrate that my constituency of Honest Morn is on a super highway to the future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, could I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady, who's been a doughty champion for not only a free port, but also a nuclear power station and for a third Menai Bridge within her own constituency of Ynys Môn. And she must have been as disappointed as I was that the Welsh Labour government have decided that they will build no more roads in Wales, meaning that her constituents are going to lose out as a result of not being able to have that vital road connection.
Mr. Rees.
Time, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is committed to delivering high-quality public services. For instance, by next month there will be a record number of police officers serving communities across Wales. And we've seen crime decrease by 10% across England and Wales between 2021 and 22. As she's aware, many public services, including health and education, are devolved in Wales.
Christina Rees.
Will the Minister urge his colleagues to accept the Welsh Affairs Committee's recommendation that HS2 is reclassified as an England-only project? Wales will then receive Barnett consequentials estimated at £5 billion, allowing the Welsh Labour government to continue to expand public transport services. And people in Wales can receive the same benefits from HS2 as those in England, Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Minister.
Thank you for that answer. She knows HS2 is an England and Wales project is an important backbone of Britain's rail infrastructure, and the important thing for Wales is to be able to plug into it and take advantage of it. We also need to see in Wales a roads review that the Welsh Government has brought forward being scrapped with investment in our roads also.
That completes questions. Shh. Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I would like to inform members that a book of condolences for Baroness Boothroyd has been placed outside the library. I would like to point out that our live subtitles and British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings are available to watch on parliamentlive.tv. We start with questions, Prime Minister. Justin Matters.
Question number one, please, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, may I wish everyone, but in particular my honourable friend from Montgomeryshire, a very happy St David's Day. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister understands the importance of NHS staff because he was out there every Thursday night clapping for them during the pandemic. He must therefore also surely know that he hasn't got a hope of dealing with the NHS crisis if he doesn't invest in its workforce. We have a plan to double medical places and end the scandal of straight A students being denied the chance to become a doctor. Patients support our plan. The NHS supports our plan. Even his Chancellor supports our plan. Why doesn't he? Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman needs to keep up. We are doing a workforce plan for the NHS. There are tens of thousands more doctors, more nurses in the NHS, record number of GPs, record investment in the NHS. That's what you get with a Conservative government delivering.
Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating the staff of Nottingham University Hospitals Trust, who, faced with a challenging winter with 300 COVID and flu patients, as well as thousands of appointments affected by industrial action, who have succeeded in reducing the backlog of those waiting more than 18 months for surgery by a quarter in just a month? And will he further reaffirm the Government's commitment to the redevelopment of the Queen's Medical Centre and City Hospitals, the second biggest hospital investment programme in the country?
Prime Minister. Well, I join my honourable friend in thanking everyone at Nottingham University Hospitals Trust for their fantastic work, and I can confirm that we are committed to a new hospital scheme at Queen's Medical Centre and City Hospital as part of our new hospital programme. I know that progress is being made, and I look forward to seeing the project come to completion.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I join the Prime Minister in wishing everybody a happy St David's Day? Mr. Speaker, after 13 years of Tory failure, the average family in Britain will be poorer than the average family in Poland by 2030. Exactly. That's a shocking state of affairs. If the Tories limp on in government, we're going to see a generation of young people learning to say Auf Wiedersehen pet in Polish, aren't we?
Mr. Speaker, it's clear to everyone that the biggest impact on households' living standards is the energy prices that we're suffering at the moment as a result of an illegal war in Ukraine. And I just remind the honourable gentleman what we are doing to ease people through that. Because of our energy price guarantee, right now the government is paying over half of a typical household energy bill, saving households right now £1,000. It is one of the most generous support schemes globally. Now, he knows future decisions to support cost of living are for the budget, but if he's concerned about the cost of living, what he should do is stop making inflationary, unfunded spending commitments and back our plan to halve inflation.
The dictionary definition for unfunded commitments is last year's kamikaze budget. Mr. Speaker, the only country in the G7 still poorer than it was before the pandemic, and he stands there pretending it's all fine. Total denial about the damage and decline that he is presiding over. Delivering growth and tackling the cost of living crisis will mean standing up to vested interests. Energy bills are going to go up by £900 in April. He knows he's going to have to act, but who's going to pay? Hard-working families through higher taxes and more borrowing, or the oil and gas giants celebrating record profits?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable gentleman. He made a rare trip out of North London to visit Davos. Recently. Perhaps while he was there, he missed the survey of 4,000 global CEOs from 100 different countries that ranked the United Kingdom as their #1 European investment destination. Now, if he's serious about getting the economy growing, then he should stand up to the vested interests in the unions and back our minimum service levels.
Mr. Speaker, here's the thing. All the CEOs of business saying there's only one party with a plan for growth, and it's this party here. And there's only one party that broke the economy, and they're sitting there. Now, on energy bills, it's not as complicated as he pretends. Oil and gas companies are making vast, unexpected profits, whilst working people face misery of higher bills. He can boast all he likes, but companies like Shell didn't pay a penny in windfall tax last year, and they're still not paying their fair share now. Why doesn't he admit his mistake, get rid of the loopholes in his botched windfall tax, and finally choose family finances over oil profits?
Mr. Speaker, there's a theme here. He seems to forget, as Chancellor, I introduced a new tax on energy companies. Energy companies will pay a 75% tax rate on extraordinary profits, comparable, indeed higher than other North Sea nations. Now, that's what his shadow levelling up secretary called for recently. But I've got good news for them. We did it a year ago. They've got to keep up. Now, I know, Mr. Speaker, they claim to support levelling up, but they really do need to keep up.
Keir Starmer. He introduced a tax on Shell and they haven't paid a penny. Fantastic work. If he was serious about investing in the future of the country, he'd start with housing. A few months ago, his backbenchers forced him to scrap house-building targets. At the time, he stood there and said it would mean they would build more homes. Well, would you believe it? A few months later, the Home Builders Federation say house building is going to fall to its lowest level in 75 years. Now, he can change course on this. He can bring back targets and planning reforms, or he can duck that fight and let a generation down. Which is it?
Prime Minister.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, we've had recordly high numbers of house building and indeed the highest number of first-time buyers in around 20 years under this government. But he talks about investing for the long term of our country, and that's important when it comes to energy security, Mr. Speaker. But Labour's policy is to oppose any new oil and gas licences in the North Sea. It is an absurd policy that would see us paying billions to countries abroad for our energy while shipping it here with twice the carbon emissions. It's typical political posturing, it's bad for the economy, it's bad for our security, just like the Labour Party.
What? Because of the noise, I don't think the Prime Minister is hearing the questions, because I do think it was on house building. Keir Starmer.
On house building, Mr. Speaker, that's the lowest level for 75 years. A whole generation of people desperate to get on the housing ladder, 13 years in power, and all he's got to say to them is, it's somebody else's fault, let me deflect. No wonder they're furious with his government. And it's not just bills or housing. Families are paying over £1,000 a month just to send their child to nursery. If he scrapped his non-dom status, he could start to fund better childcare, put money back in people's pockets and get parents back to work. Seems a pretty simple choice to me. So what's he going to choose? Wealthy tax avoiders or hard-working parents?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if we want to see what happens with house building under a Labour government, just look what's going on in London, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to tax, the facts don't suit his argument. Let's just go over them. The wealthiest pay more tax, the poorest pay less tax than under any year of the last Labour government, Mr. Speaker. Now, about his plans, he's already spent the money he claims he'd raised from that policy on 5 different things, Mr. Speaker. It's the same old Labour Party, always running out of other people's money.
Mr. Speaker, he's never happier than he's pretending everything's fine or blaming someone else. And didn't we just see it there? He is choosing tax avoiders over hard-working parents. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to finish this session without asking about the COVID disclosures in today's Daily Telegraph. Now, we don't know the truth of what happened yet. There are too many messages and too many unknowns. Oh, but families across the country will look at this and the sight of politicians writing books, portraying themselves as heroes or selectively leaking messages will be insulting and ghoulish spectacle for them. At the heart of this is every family who made enormous sacrifices for the good of the country or who tragically lost loved ones. The country deserves better. The COVID inquiry has already cost the taxpayer £85 million and hasn't heard from a single government minister yet. So can the Prime Minister assure the House no more delays, that the inquiry will have whatever support it needs to report by the end of this year?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, the last couple of years were an incredibly difficult time for everyone involved in the health service, and I pay tribute to all their hard work, and I know the House will join me in that regard. And now, rather than comment on piecemeal bits of information, I'm sure the honourable gentleman will agree with me the right way for these things to be looked at is the COVID inquiry. That's why we've established the COVID inquiry, and he will know, as he has mentioned it 1 or 2 times before that he was a lawyer in a previous life, that there is a proper process to these things. It is an independent inquiry. It has the resources it needs. It has the powers it needs. And what we should all do in this House is let them get on and do their job.
I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's work to resolve the Rubik's Cube of the Northern Ireland Protocol. This opens the prospect for resuming more positive relations with our nearest neighbours. Last week, Imperial College generously hosted an event to celebrate 25 years of the Environmental Audit Committee's scrutiny work. Academics from Imperial and the other world-class universities that support our work have been clamouring to re-engage with their research partners through Horizon and other programmes. Can my right honourable friend assure the House that he is commenced negotiations to resume an association for the UK with Horizon Europe.
Prime Minister. Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his support for the Windsor Framework. He's right about the benefits that it can bring, and also join him in paying tribute to our incredible research community who do a fantastic job. I can assure my right honourable friend that we will continue to work with the EU in a range of areas, not just research collaboration, but also strengthening our sanctions against Russia, energy security, and crucially, illegal migration. I look forward to those discussions and hope we can conclude them productively on a range of different areas.
We now come to SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister said that EU single market access was special, exciting and attractive. If that's the case, why is he denying it to the rest of us?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's disappointing that the honourable gentleman is seeking to play politics with the situation in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, as he well knows, has a unique place in the United Kingdom, and what we are trying to do is restore the balance inherent in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and he would do well to acknowledge that.
Stephen Flynn! Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. What the Prime Minister said yesterday was that EU single market access will be a good thing for business. Now, of course, that's in contrast to the leader of the Labour Party, who said in December that EU single market access would not boost economic growth. Does it hurt the Prime Minister to know that the Labour Party believe in Brexit more than he does?
Mr. Speaker, with regard to Northern Ireland, the important thing to note is to avoid a land border on the island of Ireland between North and South. That is what is crucial to achieve in getting the right framework for the arrangements in Northern Ireland, and the businesses there that trade across that border on a daily basis with complex supply chains need and value that access. That is something that the Windsor Framework has sought to achieve, and I believe delivers it. It's not about the macro issue of membership of the European Union. It's about getting the right mechanisms in place to support businesses and communities in Northern Ireland. And I would say to the honourable gentleman, he knows better than that. He knows that this is about Northern Ireland, and I hope that he can support what we've agreed.
Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister, like me, was excited to see the first new nuclear reactor for a UK power station in more than 3 decades arrive at Hinkley-C this week. Will the Prime Minister make it his personal mission to deliver vital new nuclear power at Wilver in my constituency of Anismorn, one of the best nuclear sites in the UK?
Prime Minister. Well, when it comes to our energy policy, the important thing is to focus on our long-term energy security. That means more renewables, more offshore wind, hydrogen, CCS, and indeed more nuclear. Wilfer remains one of the best nuclear sites in the UK, and the strong support from the local community and indeed my honourable friend makes an attractive site for the UK's nuclear revival, and I know great nuclear, British nuclear, when that body is up and running, will be taking a very close look at it.
Colin Eastwood.
Well, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, it's great to hear the conversion that the Prime Minister has had on the benefits of the single market. Given Northern Ireland's access to the dual market, both markets, and the benefits that brings, will his government commit to investing in infrastructure and higher education provision to maximise that benefit?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for his engagement and support in developing the Windsor Framework. I think it delivers on what he wanted, which is to ensure that we do protect Northern Ireland's businesses and the supply chains that they have, and I can give him that commitment. He and I both want to see more investment in Northern Ireland, not just from the government, but also from the private sector. This agreement will unlock that investment. Critically, a step on that journey is to have a reformed executive, something that I know everyone in this House would like to see.
Sir Oliver Hill.
Does my right honourable friend agree that in these difficult times the free world must stand together? And with that in mind, would he also agree that strengthening our friendships and support with other countries in Europe is important? Will he welcome the delegation here today from Lithuania? And does he agree with me that the decision to hold the head of states of NATO meeting in Lithuania, in Vilnius in July, shows what a strong ally they are, and also how important we think it is to strengthen the eastern flank.
Prime Minister.
No, I agree with my right honourable friend. I'm delighted that Lithuania and the city of Vilnius will host the NATO Leaders Summit in July, and the UK does have a strong and growing relationship with Lithuania. It was just yesterday that their defence minister was here supporting our efforts together with them to train Ukrainian soldiers, and at the summit we will work together to ensure we can deter and defend against Russian aggression by making sure that we implement the next phase of the most radical military transformation since the 1960s.
Sarah Chuck.
To date, 79 people have been killed on smart motorways. Last January, the government said it would pause their rollout. The Prime Minister said smart motorways are unpopular because they are unsafe. We need to listen to drivers and stop with the pursuit of policies that go against common sense. Since then, 3 new schemes have gone live, with 3 more expected shortly. Prime Minister, especially during a cost of living crisis, how do you justify pushing ahead with these death trap roads?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, safety on our roads is our absolute priority, and we will do everything we can to make sure drivers do feel safe. Last year, we in fact paused the rollout of smart motorways not already in construction while we consider the data and next steps. And in the meantime, we've committed almost £900 million for safety improvements across the entire network.
Angela Richardson.
Zero Carbon Guildford won national recognition here in Parliament, receiving the Climate Coalition's Innovative UK Community Project Award. They've taken what is often an overwhelming subject and turned it into local issues with tangible solutions to give people agency. Will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating all the volunteers, including Ben, Izzy and Mark, on their award, and does he agree that grassroots organisations like Zero Carbon Guildford are key stakeholders in our national journey to achieve net zero?
Prime Minister.
I join my honourable friend in congratulating Zero Carbon Guildford for receiving the Climate Coalition's Innovative UK Community Project Award. She's absolutely right that community empowerment, engagement and action can play a role in supporting the UK's transition to net zero, enabling communities to access the benefits that it brings, from greener jobs to improved health.
Cal Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I met with RCN nurses, and one of the biggest challenges that they face is the crumbling buildings of the Royal Lancaster Infirmary. Hospital bosses were promised capital funding as part of one of these so-called 40 new hospitals back in January, but it's March and they haven't seen a penny. So how many broken hospitals and broken promises will it take for the Prime Minister to finally fix something?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're investing record sums in the hospital capital upgrade programme across the country. I'm very happy to make sure that we're making progress on the scheme that she mentioned and ensure that gets the detail of that. But not just the 40 hospitals, but 90 upgrades around the country and up to 300 community diagnostic centres and electrical surgical hubs. This is a government that is backing the NHS with the resources it needs.
Craig Tracy.
Mr. Speaker, the tragic death of more than 50 people over the weekend when their small boat broke up off the coast of Italy is a sad reminder of the total disregard for life that the illegal traffickers who facilitate these crossings have in order to make their money. So can the Prime Minister set out what steps he's taken to bring an end to this barbaric trade, and also to reassure my constituents that stopping illegal immigration remains a key priority for this government?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is right that the tragic incident near Italy at the weekend demonstrates how too well illegal crossings put lives at risk. That's why last year the Home Secretary and I announced 5 new measures to tackle the problem of small boats crossings, including the largest ever boats deal with France and a landmark deal with Albania. But we must do more, and as soon as the legislation is ready, it will be brought to this House to ensure that if you arrive in this country illegally, you will not be able to stay. You will be swiftly detained and removed to your own country or a safe third country alternative. That is the right and responsible way to tackle this problem.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and I have one thing in common. We've both had to step in and sort out legal and constitutional messes created by his predecessor but one, the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge. Now, the Prime Minister has boasted that his new Brexit deal puts Northern Ireland in an unbelievably special position. because it will have access to both the UK and the EU markets. And he said that this makes it the world's most exciting economic zone. So my question for the Prime Minister is this. If there can be a very, very special status for the province of Northern Ireland, why can't there be a very, very special status for the nation of Scotland?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there is a very special status for the nation of Scotland, and that's inside our United Kingdom.
Cadwallader University Health Board was yet again put in special measures. The chairman and the whole board resigned en masse as they no longer have faith in the Welsh Labour government. Yet on a call earlier this week, the Welsh Health Minister told me that it wasn't Welsh Labour government's fault that healthcare has collapsed in North Wales. Now, given that Labour run the NHS in North Wales, can he suggest to the people of North Wales whose fault it is and who should put it right?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I share my honourable friend's concern, and the House will know that health is a devolved matter for the Labour-run government in Wales, where 1 in 5 people, Mr. Speaker, in the entire country of Wales are now on a waiting list. So the government there should focus on the people's priorities and start cutting waiting lists, as we are doing here in England.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent survey I did in Edinburgh West showed that a heartbreaking 80% of those who responded said the high cost of energy meant they would have to ration it. Now, I do not represent a deprived area of the country. And almost a quarter of Scottish homes now live in fuel poverty, not helped, of course, by the total absence of an insulation programme by the Scottish Government. So will the Prime Minister now accept that to allow the price cap to rise will only make things worse for millions of families? And given the significant reduction in the costs of wholesale energy, will he accept that it's now time to listen to the Liberal Democrats and cut bills to April last year's levels?
Mr. Speaker, it's the Liberal Democrat shadow energy secretary who said that there was no role for nuclear power in our future energy industry is not something that we need to listen to. But with regard to supporting people with energy bills, as I said earlier, because of the energy price guarantee, we're paying typically around half of a family's energy bill at the moment. That's worth £1,000 at the moment. But the support doesn't end there, Mr. Speaker. Over this next year, there will be around £1,000 of direct support to the most vulnerable families across the nation with their energy bills. And with regard to energy efficiency, I agree with her, it is important, which is why this government has allocated over £6 billion over this Parliament. And the new schemes that we've just put in place will help hundreds of thousands of households across the country, saving them around £300 on their bills through improvements to their energy efficiency. And you're right, it should be available everywhere, including in Scotland.
Alberta Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As chairman of the All-Party Group for Greece, can I put on record how sad we all are for the tragic train accident that's happened in Greece and for the tragic loss of life? Mr. Speaker, double child rapist and killer Colin Pitchfork is once again up for parole next month. Now, I know the Prime Minister doesn't have any decision-making process in terms of the Independent Parole Board, but can he organise an urgent meeting with the Secretary of State for Justice so I can refer my constituents' views about this dangerous man and he can take that into account in his submissions to the Independent Parole Board?
Well, Mr. Speaker, Pitchfork's crimes were heinous, and our thoughts remain with Linda and Dawn's friends and family. My honourable friend knows that it is for the Parole Board to determine these decisions, but my honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, will be submitting his views on the Pitchfork case to the Parole Board before the oral hearing, is happy to meet with the honourable gentleman again, and we have also recently published a root and branch review of the Parole Board system, which outlined our plans to introduce greater ministerial oversight, and I look forward to having the contributions and thoughts on that from my honourable friend.
Ruth Cabret.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, new figures showed that there's been a 26% increase in people sleeping rough. Meanwhile, a Conservative Party donor spent £25,000 on a crystal-encrusted portrait of the Prime Minister, and another paid £40,000 for a shooting trip. Wow. Doesn't this show just how out of touch the Conservative Party is on the cost of living crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, rough sleeping levels are actually 35% lower in this past year compared to the peak. That's partly as a result of the £2 billion of extra investment that we've made over these 3 years to tackle rough sleeping, and we continue to have one of the lowest rates of rough sleeping in the world globally when last measured. But we'll continue to do more, Mr. Speaker. We don't want anyone to have to sleep rough, and because of the innovations that we have made, we're taking more and more people off the streets, and the government will keep delivering more.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, last month the Pines Primary School in Bracknell achieved a good rating in its Ofsted inspection. Yeah. That in itself is laudable. What's significant is that the Pines is now the 40th of 40 eligible schools in Bracknell to be graded good or outstanding. Mr. Speaker, this clean sweep is an outstanding achievement, and I'm very proud of everyone locally. So would the Prime Minister please join with me in congratulating our fantastic teachers, staff, governors and pupils, and also Councillor Gareth Barnard and the entire education team at Conservative-run Bracknell Forest Council.
Well, Mr. Speaker, education is the closest thing we have to a silver bullet for transforming people's lives, so I'm delighted to join with my honourable friend in praising everyone involved, from the councillor to the teachers to the staff to the governors, for delivering such fantastic results. They are in the business of providing tremendous opportunity for the children under their care, and we all owe them an enormous debt of gratitude.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Citizens Advice estimate that the number of households unable to afford their energy bills will double from 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 from April. Labour, Mr. Speaker, has a plan to help struggling families right across the country now. Why can't the Prime Minister see the need to take action on energy bills now, avoid the cliff edge, and they can shout all they like, Mr. Speaker, and stop plunging more people into poverty from April?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are helping people now. We are helping people with the energy price guarantee that is ensuring that there is a £1,000 saving on their energy bills right now. And, Mr. Speaker, we're providing further support over the coming year for the most vulnerable, with direct cost of living support worth up to £1,000, but also a record increase in pensions, record increase in benefits, and a record increase in the national living wage, because that's what a Conservative government does.
Of ceramics businesses are SMEs, which has meant they've not received the level of support that many other energy-intensive sectors have. So will my right honourable friend look at what more support, particularly financial support, can be offered to help this sector to decarbonise and invest in energy efficiency measures?
Prime Minister.
Well, I know my honourable friend is a powerful advocate for his ceramics industry, and rightly so. It's been a pleasure to meet with him and his businesses in the past. He'll know that our energy bill discount scheme does support businesses with their energy bills through to March of next year, and there are a range of other funds we have to support energy-intensive industries, the scheme that he mentioned, but also the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, which provides capital grants to businesses like his to help them decarbonise, and I look forward to discussing this with him and his businesses in the near future.
Patrick Ready.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been announced that on the 7th of May, a coronation choir will perform at Windsor Castle, comprised of some of the UK's keenest community choirs and amateur singers, such as refugee choirs, NHS choirs, LGBTQ+ singing groups, and deaf signing choirs. If it turns out that any of the refugees taking part in that choir have arrived here on small boats or from a safe third country, should they be deported to Rwanda before or after they sing for the King?
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, it's amazing. It is amazing when previously we have had a question about the awful tragedy of illegal migration that happened just recently, that the honourable gentleman can't accept that it is, in fact, there is absolutely nothing compassionate about tolerating illegal migration when people are dying. That's why this government will bring forward legislation to improve the system here, and it is absolutely right that if people come here illegally, they should be sent to a safe alternative, because that is the only way we will break the cycle of these criminal gangs and stop people dying needlessly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A school in my constituency was complaining that they cannot afford to turn the heating on.
Yet this school and others are spending money on PSHE materials by organisations such as Stonewall and Jigsaw that are educating our boys and girls that they may not have been born in the right body or have an inner gender identity. Would the PM meet with me to see how we can stop this unscientific, ideological education being taught in our schools and get our children learning what they should be learning in a warm, safe place?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, we have boosted school funding by around £2 billion in each of the next 2 years, which will help schools manage their energy costs. But we do expect schools to take responsible and sensible decisions on their RHSE materials and making sure that those materials are age appropriate, suitable, politically impartial and value for money. I look forward to discussing this with him in the future, and I will ensure that he gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
Final question, Rosie Duffield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister may be aware of Sky News' investigation and report today on the over-the-counter sales of nitrous oxide or laughing gas to children and young teenagers. One alarming aspect is the change in the size of canisters from 8 grams to 620 grams. Wow. And ambulance call-outs related to overuse have tripled. Instead of criminalising the young people who buy nitrous oxide, isn't it time to take urgent action against those knowingly selling this harmful and potentially life-changing substance to children underage?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. I share her concern and the concern of members across the House about nitrous oxide's detrimental impact on communities, its contribution to antisocial behaviour, and indeed I mentioned it in the speech I made at the beginning of this year specifically. The Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs is conducting a review of nitrous oxide and is looking particularly at this question. The Home Secretary has asked them to expedite their review, and we will consider their advice carefully when it is received.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. No, after urgent questions. We now come to the urgent question. Liz Kendall.
Secretary of State, if you will make a statement on testing of care home residents during the COVID pandemic.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID-19 pandemic was an unprecedented global health emergency involving a novel coronavirus that we were still learning about day by day, even hour by hour. Even in those early days, the UK government and colleagues in my department were clear. Testing would be crucial. That is why, Mr. Speaker, the former Secretary of State, the Right Honourable Member for West Suffolk, set ambitious testing targets to drive a true step change in the quantity of tests, because he knew testing would be a vital lifeline until the vaccines could be developed and proven safe and effective. The importance of testing was never in doubt, and there was full agreement on that in every part of government, from the Chief Medical Officer to the Health Secretary to the Prime Minister. But in a situation where we had the capacity to test at most a few thousand each day, tough decisions about prioritisation had to be made, decisions that were taken on the best public health advice available. And thanks in no small part to the bold testing ambitions driven by government, we were able to build the largest testing network in Europe. I want to put on record my thanks to all those who worked tirelessly on this mission day and night, from civil servants to the NHS, and of course our incredible social care workforce who did so much to look after their residents. They all deserve our lasting gratitude. Mr. Speaker, the situation in our care homes was extremely difficult in the pandemic, not just in England, but across the UK, and indeed across the world, because of the vulnerability of residents and the large numbers of people who come in and out of care homes. It is vital that we learn lessons. It's equally vital, Mr. Speaker, that we learn those lessons in the right context. I should mention that selective snippets of WhatsApp conversations give a limited and at times misleading insight into the machinery of government at the time. That is why the COVID inquiry is so important, so we have the right preparations in place to meet future threats and challenges. Thank you.
Senator Minister Liz Kendall.
Mr. Speaker, throughout the COVID pandemic, ministers repeatedly claimed they threw a protective ring around England's care homes and always followed the evidence and scientific advice. But WhatsApp messages from the former Health Secretary revealed in today's Telegraph suggest nothing could be further from the truth. Can the Minister now confirm that the Chief Medical Officer first advised the Government to test all residents going into care homes in early April 2020? Can she explain why the former Health Secretary rejected this advice and failed to introduce community testing until the 14th of August, a staggering 4 months later? Can she publish the evidence that following the advice would have muddied the waters, as the member for West Suffolk claimed? And can she confirm that 17,678 people died of COVID in care homes between the CMO's advice and the government finally deciding to act? She should know, Mr. Speaker, because she was responsible for care homes at the time. Now, former ministers are touring the studios this morning, claiming this delay was simply because there weren't enough tests. Where is the evidence for this? And even if tests were in short supply, why weren't care home residents prioritised when the devastating impact of COVID was there for all to see? Now, Mr. Speaker, nobody denies that dealing with COVID was unbelievably difficult, especially in the early days. But care home residents and staff were simply not a priority. Yet the former Prime Minister and Health Secretary were first warned about the emerging horror in care homes by my honourable friend, the member for Hove, in March 2020. I myself raised the lack of testing in care homes with the Health Secretary. On the 8th of April, the 28th of April, the 19th of May and the 17th of June, long before the CMO's advice was finally followed. The Minister will no doubt say all these issues will be looked at in the public inquiry, but the findings from this won't be available for years. Mr. Speaker, the families of the 43,000 care home residents who lost their lives will be appalled at the former Health Secretary attempting to rewrite history, an attempt that will turn to ashes along with his TV career. We need more humility and less celebrity from the member for West Suffolk, and above all, we need answers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say actually that I think it's relatively easy for the honourable member to come to the House today and make these highly political points. And knowing actually how she and I worked together in the pandemic, and she and I talked about all that we were doing to look after people in care homes, I am, as I say, shocked and disappointed in the tone that she has taken today when we are dealing with extremely serious questions. I will turn first to some of the difficult prioritisation decisions that were made given the limited quantity of testing that we had at the beginning of the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, the government followed the expert public health advice available at the time. We had the capacity to test just 3,000 cases a day in mid-March, and I'm sure colleagues will understand why the health advice was at the time to prioritise those working on our NHS front line, and, for instance, the testing of people in hospitals who had symptoms, and indeed within care homes, again, people with symptoms. In fact, the courts have already agreed that our prioritisation decisions on testing were completely rational. As we dramatically ramped up testing capacity, Mr. Speaker, we also adjusted that prioritisation in line with the public health advice and the capacity. So by mid-April, just a month later, with testing capacity exceeding 38,000, we were then in a position to test more widely. In fact, that's reflected in our adult social care plan, which was published on the 15th of April. That made clear that everyone being discharged from a hospital to a care home should be tested, even if asymptomatic, and that all discharged patients, regardless of the results of their test, should be isolated for 14 days. And it's worth reflecting, Mr. Speaker, just what a dramatic increase in testing the government oversaw, from just 3,000 in March 2020 to over 38,000 in mid-April to over 100,000 by mid-May, to the point where we could test many millions in a single week. We established the largest testing network in Europe from a standing start, and the science proves that it saved lives. Now, the Honourable Lady asked about some of the content of the WhatsApp messages which have been published. And I would say to her, that is a selection of messages from a larger quantity of messages. And actually, clearly, while there were discussions and debates between ministers and between colleagues which took place in part on WhatsApp, there were clearly meetings and conversations and other forums in which advice was given and decisions made. And a huge quantity of that is with the public inquiry. But I can say to her, for instance, that a meeting to discuss the implementation of the advice on testing was not referenced in the WhatsApp messages that she is talking about. But for instance, there is an email following exactly this exchange that she's referring to that says we can press straight away. We can press ahead straight away with hospitals testing patients who are going to care homes. And we should aspire to, as soon as capacity allows, and when we've worked out an operational way of delivering this, that everyone going into a care home from the community could be tested. So, as I say to her, there's very selective information that she is basing her comments on. As I said, the Honourable Lady knows how the government, and me personally, strained every single work day and night, did everything in our power to help people, and specifically the most vulnerable during the pandemic. She and I spoke about it regularly during our frequent calls. In fact, at the time, I appreciated her perspective, her questions, her insights from her own area of Leicester. And I say to her, we should go about this discussion in the right way for the country. This is not the time to play political games. We should look to save lives. That's the purpose of the public inquiry, to learn lessons in the right way in case this should ever happen again.
Sir Oliver
My honourable friend will agree that it was Labour that called for a public inquiry. The government agreed to it. It's a full public inquiry. You couldn't have a better judge than Dame Heather Hallett, somebody one of our most experienced and distinguished judges. She'll do a very thorough job, and what we're seeing today is a bit of trial by media and party politics to sheer cream.
My honourable friend is exactly right. We're having a public inquiry. The government is fully cooperating with that public inquiry, so they have all the information that is required to look through all that happened, to investigate it, and rather than trying to score political points, to actually truly learn lessons for the benefit of the country.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 2nd of April, excuse me, on the 2nd of April 2020, I wrote to the former Health and Social Care Secretary, jointly with my right honourable friend, the member for Leicester South, highlighting the urgent need for testing in care homes for staff and residents, and particularly for patients being discharged from hospital. I knew, as did other colleagues at the time, that without testing, in my constituency, care homes in my constituency and those across the country were suffering a heavy toll of deaths of residents. Indeed, one of our care home managers died of COVID in my constituency. Further, at a session of the Health and Social Care Committee in July 2021, I asked the Right Honourable Member for West Suffolk why the government had not taken up the offer from care providers of facilities to isolate people discharged from hospital before admitting them to care homes. He told me that he did not know anything about the letter, despite it being sent by Care England. Will the Minister now admit that the Department and Ministers failed to understand and to involve social care in the key decisions about the COVID pandemic, and ignored letters for offering help which could have saved lives.
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady is right about the importance of testing, and it's a view that she has, but I had at the time, and as indeed some of the exchanges will show, how I, as Social Care Minister, and as you would expect, was arguing very hard for testing for care homes. I know, of course, that other ministers and other people were arguing for the things that they had oversight of, and then ultimately, of course, the Health Secretary and Prime Minister have to make decisions based every step of the way, clearly, on the public health, the scientific advice on these things, as we did. I mean, to that point, during the course of the pandemic, as the capacity allowed, millions of tests were distributed to care homes. And as I've already said, as the capacity increased, care homes were prioritised in that process. And specifically to one of the points she made, the guidance set out on the 15th of April was not only that everyone discharged from hospital to a care home should be tested, but also that they should be isolated.
Exactly. Peter Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems to me that the opposition want to rewrite history. The fact is, at the time, people didn't know what was right or what was wrong. The Minister, the Secretary of State, listened to a whole lot of advice and then had to make a decision. Even one of the WhatsApp messages I've seen says, "Tell me if I'm wrong." So it seems to me what should happen is the COVID inquiry should deal with all these matters properly. The one question I would have for the Minister is it possible to get the COVID inquiry to report earlier?
Minister.
Well, again, I completely agree with my honourable friend about the COVID inquiry being the right place to go through the details of what happened, who said what, and, as he said, the genuine debates that there were, of course, behind the scenes, because this was a new virus. And at the time, we had only limited information about it. For instance, it wasn't known when it first hit our shores who was going to be most vulnerable to it. We didn't know about things like asymptomatic transmission. So there was a huge amount of uncertainty at the time about which the best possible decisions were made. To his question about the timing of the public inquiry, I think that is not something which is in the control of ministers.
Daisy Cooper.
Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sorry, my apologies. The leaked WhatsApp messages from the then Health Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for West Suffolk, showed that despite a shortage in COVID tests in September 2020, one of the Minister's advisers sent a test to the Right Honourable Member for North East Somerset's home by courier. Wow. This is yet more evidence that it's one rule for Conservative ministers and another for everyone else. So can the Minister please inform the House how many other government ministers, Conservative MPs and their families received priority tests during the pandemic when there was a shortage of tests?
Well, actually, I would say to her, much though it's a difficult thing for me as a minister to see WhatsApp messages from me, in fact, in the pages of the newspaper. If she has read those, she will see that I was seeking a test for a member of my family and using exactly the same test app as everybody else to try and get access to a test that was needed.
Mr.
Speaker, I seem to recall 2 years ago when there was a limited supply of testing equipment. There were all sorts of calls for certain groups to be prioritised, and there were urgent calls for available beds in hospitals to be freed up to cope with the likely surge in cases. In hindsight, some of those priorities may have been wrong ones, but at the time it was an urgent situation. Will my honourable friend confirm that exactly the same set of priorities about access to testing prevailed in Wales, and it took the Welsh Government 2 weeks longer to make mandated testing to care home residents in Wales than it did in England? And why are we not seeing equal outrage from the opposition about that?
Actually, I mean, he makes a really important point about the challenges that were faced, as I mentioned earlier, around the world handling the pandemic. but very conspicuously for us across the UK, and decisions that were having to be taken in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, as well as here in England. And the other thing I'd say to that is, were members opposite in the position that we were in government and having to make these difficult decisions, I'm sure that they, like us, actually, would have strained every sinew and done their very best to make the best possible decisions in the situation of limited information.
Janet David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Even if we now know that the Secretary of State was not following the scientific advice, the Minister for Care was in her job at the time these decisions were being made. Can the Minister explain why she didn't do the right thing then? Was she not listening to the Chief Medical Officer either?
I fear she didn't hear my previous answer, which was to say that actually the public health advice and the advice of the Chief Medical Officer was followed. Of course, there is a job to do. You get the advice, and then you also have to look at the practicalities of implementation. As the volume of tests became available, those tests were used as advised, following the public health advice.
Dr. Kiraman.
I'm not going to forget the totally shameless politicking of the pandemic undertaken by those opposite. I remember very specifically throughout the pandemic, she's left her place now, the Deputy Leader, talking about, and the Shadow Leader of the Opposition, talking about how we had the worst death toll in Europe, and they said that again and again and again and again. Actually, and I hear the Shadow Minister from a steady position saying we did. The studies now show that we were ahead of Italy, ahead of Spain, broadly in line with France and Germany, and very far from the worst in Europe. Have we ever heard any of them come to this dispatch box and apologise for misleading the British public about our record in the pandemic? Does she agree that they might seek to do that before they further criticise us for our record?
Again, he is right on this, and the right thing to do for us as a country is reflect overall on how we handled the pandemic and the decisions that we made, and indeed how prepared we were in the first place. That's the right way to do it. Of course, every life lost is a life that we regret losing, and I think about the families who've lost, whether it's mothers and fathers, brothers, sisters, grandmas, husbands. It's so deeply sad that so many lives were lost, but this is something that affected us here in England, say across the UK, and indeed across the world. But the right thing to do is for us to look at these things in the inquiry and the reasoned environment, and then use the lessons learned and the reflections of that inquiry to make sure that we can do better in the event that we should ever have to face another pandemic like it.
Karen Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The government entered the pandemic unprepared, ignoring Operation Cygnus and the lessons they could have done, and ran the NHS at 96% capacity. That was part of the problem. We all know mistakes happen. We all know it was really difficult. But today is really disappointing because some humility should have been brought to this. Over 17,000 people lost their lives. It is our job as the opposition to scrutinise decisions. The former Secretary of State has thrown his colleagues under a bus because of his own vanity. I would suggest that government ministers need to use this time to actually come forward, now that ease the family's suffering, with more detail on actually what did happen before the inquiry.
There's already been legal investigation into some of the aspects that we are talking about today. But actually, given the huge number of decisions were made, the period of time we're talking about, actually the right way to do this is bring all this evidence together in the form of a public inquiry, have it fully looked through, and that's the best way to answer the sorts of questions that she's looking for answers for.
David Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a profoundly serious question, literally a matter of life and death. And as such, I'm sure my honourable friend is right to say that the appropriate way to reach conclusions is through a proper public inquiry conducted by a very distinguished judge. So can she assure the House that the government will be as transparent and open as possible in giving evidence to that public inquiry so that we can all be confident that at the end of this we have reached the appropriate conclusion?
I can absolutely assure my right honourable friend on that point that the government is sharing with the public inquiry a huge quantity of evidence so that it can reach the best possible, best informed conclusions.
Clive Effort.
Speaker,
The emails and WhatsApp messages expose the fact that the scientific advice was that people leaving hospital should be swabbed before they went into care homes, and that the government ignored that. Now that shows that the government was not following scientific advice. Now the Minister has said that there were other priorities that had to be considered before they could implement that policy. But there's no one who'd be more aware of the competing priorities than someone like Professor Whitty. So what was it the government knew that Professor Whitty didn't when they decided not to follow his advice?
Again, it really feels like honourable members opposite have not been listening to my answers on this. The public health advice was followed, and the situation here was a limited capacity of testing. And this is not spelled out in those messages because, as I said, there were other meetings and other conversations that took place. As soon as capacity was available, of tests was available, further testing was used for testing residents, people being discharged to care homes, for example. And I will say to him, having been Care Minister at the time, how hard we across government, not only me, but actually all of those involved in this, worked to get millions of tests during the course of the pandemic to care homes to help protect those residents, followed by prioritising those in care homes for the vaccination. Because actually, when it came down to it, though testing was helpful, what really made a difference in the pandemic was when we were able to vaccinate people, and that's what really started to provide protection.
James Wilde.
Isn't it regrettable, if all too typical, that the Labour Party ignored that when the pandemic struck there was only capacity for 2,000 tests a day, and the huge efforts that were successful to massively increase that capacity? Instead, they choose to leap on partial information to make political points rather than listen for the full facts in the public inquiry.
My honourable friend is absolutely right how we ramped up incredibly fast from a capacity of just 3,000 tests a day in March 2020 to over 38,000 in mid-April to over 100,000 by May, and then being able to test many millions a week during the course of the pandemic. That was the most extraordinary increase in the capacity to produce and carry out and analyse tests, and he's absolutely right to draw attention to it.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I note that the Minister said it's shocking what my honourable friend, the member for Leicester West, has said. It should be shocking about the number of people who died, who might have been saved in the first place. But can I ask the Minister a specific question? Is she really saying that there was no rush to get people out of hospitals back into the community without being tested at the beginning of this pandemic?
Well, I think the questions about the discharge policy that has been interrogated on a number of occasions, including, for instance, by select committees. And he'll well know, for instance, in general, and we know this in the work we're doing right now on discharge, that it's rarely a good thing for somebody who's medically fit for discharge to continue to be in hospital beyond that time. So, of course, it's right that when people are medically fit, they should be discharged home. And the guidance of how that was done was set out on a number of occasions during the pandemic, and that guidance was updated both as we learnt more about the virus and as greater testing capacity became available.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am very proud of this Conservative government's record during the pandemic. 400 million tests, a world-leading and world-beating vaccine programme, and £400 billion spent to keep jobs and people's prospects going. Clearly, hard decisions were made, and hindsight is a wonderful thing, but we shouldn't be reflecting on hindsight now. We should deal with the facts that are at hand. Does the Minister agree with me that this government will continue to take measures, and if, God forbid, there's another pandemic, we will not let the party politicking get in the way and actually make those decisions to protect lives, fund jobs, and keep our country going?
He's absolutely right, and he's right to point out the extraordinary things that were done during the pandemic. And I don't think government should seek to take credit for that. So many people worked so incredibly hard, whether it was in local authorities, in social care, in the NHS, all those involved in supply chains, for instance. So the huge efforts to actually get PPE out and to secure PPE at times when it was incredibly hard to get hold of across the world. So I'm glad that he draws attention to some of these things, and he's absolutely right that we should reflect overall in the context of the public inquiry.
Emma Orbach.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In April 2020, now disappeared government guidance in relation to hospital discharges stated negative tests are not required prior to transfers, admissions into the care home. It was later reported that this minister then leaned on Public Health England to alter its proposed advice to care homes from ensuring that those discharged from hospital tested negative to not requiring any testing at all. Why, at every stage, was the government content to send people to their deaths in our care homes?
I don't recognise her account at all there. If she looks back in some of the one of the legal cases that has looked into this question, she may find more accurate information about some of the conversations that went on behind the scenes. What I can assure her of was that in my capacity as Social Care Minister, as you would expect, I fought the corner for people in receiving care, both home care and in care homes throughout the pandemic.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The leaked WhatsApp messages are obviously going to be partial and selective, but even reading them, I note that the Minister was doing her job on behalf of my constituents on a message on the 8th of April, speaking up for a care home in Newcastle-under-Lyme and raising that with government and her fellow ministers, and everyone, I think, was doing their best. I've served on the Lessons Learned Select Committee, Madam Deputy Speaker, and there are lessons to be learned. They can be learned with the benefit of hindsight, but the hindsight we've seen from the opposition front bench today is opportunistic. The government, does she agree with me, the government was doing everything it could to respond to an unprecedented situation under severe pressure, severe supply and severe capacity constraints?
He's 100% right. That the context clearly of this is absolutely important as part of this conversation, and a global pandemic about which very little was known, about which we worked incredibly hard to find out more, and continually made the best possible decisions in the light of the information we had, at all times prioritising protecting people, saving lives, particularly those, as we learnt, who would be most vulnerable. And it's extremely disappointing to see an attempt to play politics with this issue.
James Harden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Care home residents and their families weren't just failed at the beginning of the pandemic, they were failed for the months and years that followed as families and loved ones were prevented from visiting. Now, the leaked WhatsApp showed that the Minister was arguing against the ban on visiting. Can she say why we saw that sustained for so long throughout the pandemic, and what plans she has now to make sure that families of loved ones in care homes have the right to visit if this ever happens again?
Well done.
I know how strongly the honourable member feels about this, and clearly we're having ongoing conversations about visiting at the moment in care homes. It's evident in the WhatsApps that I was concerned during the pandemic to make sure that families were able to see loved ones in care homes. As I've been saying in a number of responses to questions today, clearly public health advice had to be taken into account all the way through the pandemic, and getting the right balance between protecting people from the risk of COVID being taken into care homes and seeing friends of family was something which I'm sure, as part of the public inquiry, will be some of the discussions that will be looked into in that to answer questions such as his about the decisions taken on visiting. And I will continue to work with him here and now to make sure that those who are currently in care homes get the visiting that we think they need.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today's front page of the Telegraph revealing that the medical advice was not followed will be heartbreaking for so many families up and down the country, reopening the grief that so many felt over the loss of their loved ones. Now, I've listened carefully to the Minister's responses, and she said basically that she's unable to compel the public inquiry to move more quickly. It is above her pay grade. But what she could do right now is commit to lobbying the government to complete that public inquiry before the end of the year. She could commit to doing everything she possibly can to bringing those answers forward for all those families who are today feeling so deeply hurt and upset.
Minister.
Well, so, firstly, on the first point, her question, and she's wrong about the use of public health advice, and all decisions were informed by public health advice. But on her request for the public inquiry is independent of government. It's independent of government. So what she's asking me to do is not something I can do.
Florence Shalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just to reiterate the points that my colleague just made there. Every time there's a statement, every time there's a revelation, every time there's an issue about this raised, whether in this House or in the press, it triggers trauma for so many people who haven't healed over losing their loved ones, so many people who were not able to go to funerals, so many people who are not able to seek closure. I hope that the Minister will reflect on that in terms of her statement this afternoon. Just to come back on the public inquiry, does she agree with me and the COVID bereaved families for justice, who said that these revelations show why the bereaved families must be heard in the hearings for our lawyers to cross-examine people, including the former Secretary of State for Health, so we can get full answers to our questions in the right setting, instead of having to relive the horrors of our loss through these exposés?
Well, as I've said, what we are talking about is, very sadly, people's lives lost. And that is people's mothers and fathers, grands and grandpas, sons and daughters, sisters, brothers. We should always remember, when we talk about this, the genuine, real human cost. And also all those who, for instance, work in health and social care, looked after people who were dying and had such a traumatic time themselves. So she talks about trauma. I will say that it's her front bench who asked this urgent question and has made this conversation happen in this forum, rather, for instance, than happening in the context of a public inquiry, which might encourage a more reasoned form of debate. I say, but my tone, I hope she'll notice, fully appreciates the points that she makes, but it's not for me to dictate who will be giving evidence to the public inquiry.
Justin Mathers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Minister will recall, I spoke for the opposition on dozens of regulations to do with the pandemic, and there were occasions during that when I questioned some of the decisions that were being made, and the suspicion was that sometimes political rather than medical and scientific decisions were being taken. Clearly what has come out overnight has caused me to question that again. I hope she can understand why that is an important question of trust for us as politicians, but also for the wider public. And does she agree with me that rather than a partial and selective release of information to sell newspapers or books, that actually the public deserve the government to release all information now, so that we can actually get to the bottom of this?
Well, I do indeed remember many of those SI debates. I can assure him that it wasn't political decision-making, as he suggests. That every step of the way, ministers such as myself, the Health Secretary, and of course the Prime Minister, making incredibly difficult decisions, but always trying to do the right thing to save people's lives, to protect people from this cruel virus, which particularly attacked those who were most vulnerable, such as the frail elderly, and in doing so continuously took public health advice. And to his point, actually, that the way to look into all this that happened is indeed through the public inquiry. That's where the evidence is being provided, and that's a forum in which the reflections can be taken and the lessons can be learned.
Leila Moran.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my heart first and foremost goes out to those bereaved families. I just can't imagine what they must be feeling again today. And my heart also goes out to those care workers, many of whom also lost their lives, but also many of them survived having contracted COVID and now are living with long COVID. So they may not have lost their lives, but many did lose their livelihoods. The Minister may be aware that advice from the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council, which would give compensation to just some of those brave workers, is currently with the Department of Work and Pensions. In a recent meeting with me, the Minister told me that it could take years for this to be taken up. Can the Minister tell me what conversations has she had with DWP? And if it is going to take years, will her department set up a compensation scheme so they get the support that those brave workers deserve?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As she says, care workers were amongst those who were at the front line at the pandemic and had some really incredibly difficult experiences. and work through, even taking the risk themselves of catching COVID, and very sadly, some care workers along with NHS workers were amongst those who lost their lives. As she says, others indeed have a long COVID. She asked me about compensation, which is indeed something that is currently with the Department for Work and Pensions. In fact, a minister from that department is here on the bench. I know his department is looking at this and will be responding in due course.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for her answers? And truly, everyone's thoughts and prayers are with those of all those who lost loved ones. The impact to mental health of the COVID lockdown has been felt most keenly in care homes. And to see what the elderly people were put through and learning that the full protections were not in place, and yet they couldn't see loved ones at the end of life, is totally unacceptable. What would the Minister offer to those who lost precious hours with those they loved and adored on hearing this very, very tragic news today? Thank you.
Well, I will reiterate to those living in care homes, but of course their loved ones and families as well, that the government took every step all the way through the pandemic to protect those who we knew were vulnerable. For instance, prioritising testing, over 180 million tests going to care homes during the course of the pandemic, prioritising vaccinations. And I remember at the time talking to residents in care homes and how the vaccination for them was such a huge moment, because actually it was the first time they really felt they were protected from this truly cruel virus. It's also, I know how incredibly hard it was for families that they couldn't be with loved ones in care homes. One reason why we put out guidance about visiting, particularly saying if somebody was close to end of life, that they should be able to receive visitors. And I will continue to do my utmost as Minister for Social Care to make sure that we do our very best for those living in care homes.
I thank the Minister for answering the urgent question. We now come to statement Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab.
Madam Deputy Speaker, with your permission today I can announce that we intend to legislate as soon as possible to introduce an independent public advocate, to put victims and the bereaved at the heart of our response to large-scale public disasters, to make sure that they get the support they deserve through public inquests and inquiries, and to make sure they get the answers they need to move forward with their lives. And I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, the whole House will recall that fateful day on the 15th of April 1989 when thousands of fans prepared to watch the FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. 97 men, women and children lost their lives, unlawfully killed in our country's worst ever sporting disaster. What happened at Hillsborough was a monumental and devastating tragedy. I remember watching the scenes in horror to this day, and of course the impact is felt to this day, especially by the families and the friends of the victims. Of course, for Hillsborough survivors and the bereaved, that terrible day was just the beginning of a 34-year ordeal. It was followed by an appalling injustice, fans blamed for their own injuries, survivors and bereaved blocked at every turn in their search for answers. And frankly, Madam Deputy Speaker, we must learn the lessons of Hillsborough, and we must make sure that they never happen again. In terms of the wider context, major disasters involving significant loss of life are mercifully quite rare in the United Kingdom. But as Hillsborough, Grenfell, the Manchester bombings have shown, when they do happen, victims, families and the communities reflected and represented have not received the answers to their questions, have not received the support they need. And we are duty-bound as a government, as a House, to make sure that doesn't happen again, and to ensure positively that those families, those communities, never again have to struggle in anguish against a system created to help them in order to get the truth and some measure of accountability. Madam Deputy Speaker, the independent public advocate goes some way to making good on this government's long-standing promise to ensure that that pain, that suffering of the Hillsborough victims and other victims is never repeated again. I can tell the House it will be passed into law. It will be made up of a panel of experts to guide survivors and the bereaved in the aftermath of a major disaster. And it will deliver for them in, I think, 6 important respects that I want to outline before the House. First, the IPA will provide practical support to the families of the deceased and individuals or their representatives who have suffered a devastating or life-changing injury. This practical support includes things like helping them to understand their rights, such as the right to receive certain information at inquests or inquiries, signposting them to support services, for example, financial or mental health support. In particular, the IPA will help victims every step of the way, from the immediate aftermath of a tragic event right the way through to the conclusion of investigations, inquiries or inquests. We will make IPA support available to the closest next of kin relative, both parents, where they are separated or divorced, or to a close friend if there is no close family. And Madam Deputy Speaker, the support will also be there for the bereaved whose loved ones die after the tragedy as a result of their injuries. It was a particular issue in relation to Grenfell as well, I know from my experience as Housing Minister. The IPA will also offer support to injured victims and their representatives. Second, Madam Deputy Speaker, the IPA will give victims, critically, a voice when they need it most. It will advocate on their behalf with public authorities and the government, for example, where they have concerns about the engagement and the responsiveness of public authorities, whether it's the police, local authorities or the like, or where victims and bereaved want an investigation or an inquiry set up more swiftly to ensure maximum transparency. Third, the IPA will give a voice to the wider community, not just the direct, if you like, victims and bereaved, which have been affected most by the tragedy in question. And to achieve this, we will set up a register of advocates from a range of different professions, backgrounds and geographical areas, including doctors, social workers, emergency workers, members of the clergy, people with media handling experience, because often that is another burden which they will not have experienced, and others. And so communities will be able to nominate an advocate to act on their behalf in order to express their particular concerns and ensure that their voice is heard as a community. Fourth, Madam Deputy Speaker, the IPA will be supported by full-time, permanent staff so that it can act very swiftly when a tragedy occurs and make sure the support is there for the victims, for the families, from day one. And critically in this regard, the IPA will be there to consult with and represent victims and their families before any inquiry is set up. So the IPA will be able to make representations on the type of inquiry, whether it's statutory or non-statutory, and other important functional issues, such as the data controller powers available to any inquiry and the relationship they may have with the IPA in the exercise of such functions. Fifth, the scope of the eye will be extended to cover events in England and Wales, but of course, mindful of the devolved settlements, we will work with all the devolved administrations to ensure our plans are coordinated with the support that's being offered outside of England and Wales. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, although the IPA is first and foremost about doing better by the victims and the survivors, I think it is also worth acknowledging that it will be in the wider interest of the public. It will ensure we achieve better relationship between public bodies, government and the bereaved, that we get better, quicker answers and are able to learn and act on the lessons from such tragedies more decisively. I can tell the House that the preparatory work is now well underway to establish the IPA, and we will place it on a statutory footing as soon as is possible, and I'll say more about the legislative vehicle shortly. Now, of course, there have been other important reforms over recent years to support and empower victims and their families. We've made inquests more sympathetic to the bereaved with a refreshed, accessible guide to coroner services. So the process, if you like, which can obviously feel like a minefield to navigate, is a bit easier to digest and understand. We've removed means test funding for the exceptional case funding for legal representation at an inquest, which means that applying for legal aid is easier and less intrusive. People who have suffered a traumatic bereavement no longer have to submit the details of their personal finances to the legal aid agency, and if their case meets the exceptional case funding criteria, they'll be entitled to legal aid, whatever their means. More broadly, Madam Deputy Speaker, We are putting victims at the heart of our justice system with the quadrupling of victims funding compared to 2010 and with the louder voice through the upcoming Victims Bill. So the creation of an independent public advocate to give greater voice to the victims and the bereaved of major tragedies is the next important step forward. Now, I know that members across this House will want to join me in paying tribute to the Hillsborough families for their courage and their determination despite every setback and their long-standing struggle to stop other families from enduring the same anguish in the future. The Hillsborough families have always maintained that their struggle for truth and justice for the 97 was of national significance. And I agree entirely. And I also want to pay tribute to the families of those who died at Grenfell and the Manchester Arena bombing. Our hearts go out to them for their loss, and I pay tribute to them for their dignified courage. May I also take this opportunity to pay tribute to those in this House and the other place who have campaigned on this tirelessly. The Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, the Right Honourable Member for Garston and Halewood, the Honourable Member for Liverpool West Derby, the Noble Lord Wills, the Mayor of Liverpool and others for their steadfast commitment to establishing an IPA. I will continue to work closely with all of those honourable members, the Hillsborough families, the Grenfell groups, the families of the victims of the Manchester Arena bombing, to ensure that their experiences are taken into account and we get the detail of this right as we establish the IPA. May I also pay particular tribute to the Right Reverend James Jones, KBE, for his work on Hillsborough and his important report. I met with him last week. The government will be responding to the wider report this spring, and we know in our heads and in our hearts that there is still much more to do to heal the wounds from that horrendous and heartbreaking tragedy. But this is an important step forward. The IPA will make a real difference, and I commend the statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State Steve Root.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I start by thanking the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. For decades, the Hillsborough families fought for justice. They fought for the truth about how 97 innocent children, women and men were unlawfully killed in wholly avoidable circumstances. They faced a cover-up by public authorities who hid the truth and blamed the victims. These brave families did more than seek justice for their loved ones. They sought to shine a light on what had gone so tragically wrong, because that's how we learn how not to make the same mistake again. But it should never have taken over 3 decades. I was in Sheffield on that fateful day in 1989, just a mile or so from Hillsborough, with a junior doctor friend who was called back to the hospital to treat the victims and deal with the aftermath. So I remember vividly the horror of what we heard unfolding from the football stadium. Today, I pay tribute to those families for their long struggle for justice, and to those who've spoken up for them, notably the Right Honourable Member for Garston and Halewood, the Honourable Member for Liverpool West Derby, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, the former Prime Minister, Lord Wills, and the Mayor of Manchester. Today is a chance to balance the scales of justice and give those victims the voice they need and the power to make it heard. But it's a chance the government has missed. The government's proposals don't go far enough, and they will be too weak as they currently stand to prevent cover-ups in future. The public advocate needs to be a fully independent, permanent figure accountable to the families, not a panel of advisers appointed by the government, if they see fit, as a signposting service. It's critical that the public advocate has the full power of a data controller, not just the power to make representations, as we just heard from the Secretary of State. That means the power to access all data, communications, documents and other information to torpedo cover-ups before they can even happen. Now, we know from the Hillsborough Independent Panel that the existence of these powers would be a massive deterrent to future cover-ups. So, I would ask the Justice Secretary, will he reconsider and establish a fully independent public advocate? And will he agree to give them the full power of data controller right from the start? This matters immensely because without control over data that can expose the truth, there can be no transparency. And without transparency, there can be no justice. Now, I have to ask, how many more tragedies will it take to wake this government up? How many more lives need to be lost? Labour is committed to real change. In government, we will establish a fully independent public advocate accountable to survivors and to victims' families, and we will arm them with the power they need to access documents and data to expose the truth about what went wrong, and importantly, to stop cover-ups before they can happen. That will be part of a Hillsborough law with teeth that will also give victims' families access to legal aid and impose a duty of candour on public officials. We'll do that because we believe victims must be at the heart of the justice system, because we believe victims must have a voice and the power to make it heard, and because we understand that a system that fails to learn from its mistakes is doomed to repeat them.
Well said, Steve.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank him for his partial welcome of this announcement? I listened very carefully to what he said. I have to say, we share, and I share with him personally, the commitment and the desire to set up the most credible advocacy for the bereaved and the victims and the families. And of course, I'm very happy to work with him and honourable members on all sides in relation to the detail. But I don't accept his characterisation. He said it wasn't independent, but in fact, it would be decided on the basis of consultations with the victims and the bereaved. And that must be right in order to make sure you have the right range of experts to deal with the particular circumstances of the tragedy in question. It would act on their behalf, it would not act on behalf of the government. The data controller powers he's referred to, I understand exactly the point he makes, and as I said in my statement, it will be important that there will be consultation with the families, and the IPA will be able to consult with a putative independent inquiry. But I think he has to recognise that the independent inquiry will have many of those powers itself, and therefore, how will he reconcile that with duplicated powers in an IPA? But this is something we should talk about, and I know it's been raised by the Honourable Lady, but I would genuinely say we want to get this right, but I think actually what you risk is a conflict of functions, which is what we would all want to avoid. He mentioned other measures like the duty of candour. That is a broader issue for the government's report to the wider Hillsborough report. That is expected in spring. I know it's been a long time coming, but those broader issues, I think it's right to deal with them. I felt, in relation to the IPA, that although it is only part of the redress and the accountability, that we were in a position not just to bring forward the policy announcement, but also in due course very shortly be able to say something about the legislative vehicle, and it's important for the bereaved, for the victims, for the families, and because it's such an important issue, to bring that forward now and not to wait any longer.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for bringing this statement to the House today and welcome the decision to introduce an independent public advocate, which was, of course, a commitment in our 2017 manifesto. But I'm sure my right honourable friend will understand that I want to ensure that this body is going to meet the ambition of the commitment that we made in that manifesto. And I'm happy to work with him to do that. But for today, could he please just go back on two particular issues? One is this question of whether the families, the victims, the survivors will be able themselves to initiate the independent public advocate so that they are not relying on the government to do that for them, because certainly in the case of Hillsborough, it was the fact that the state and state authorities shut their doors to people that led to the 34 years wait for any answers for the families. And also in line with that, will he look again or ensure that the IPA has the ability to compel the provision of information and evidence to the families? He is assuming an inquiry is always going to take place. That might not be the case. It is essential that the families have answers to their perfectly reasonable questions.
Can I thank my right honourable friend and pay tribute again to her for her campaigning and her advocacy on this. On the right of initiative, ultimately the government will have to decide the shape and, of course, of any IPA that is set up. But, of course, one of the challenges will be, and there is clearly set out the right of consultation, is where there are different views that are expressed as to quite how the IPA should be configured for a particular inquiry, and ultimately the government will have to try and reconcile that where there are differences. So I do think it is right, while committing to an IPA, to allow the government to engage, to allow victims, the bereaved, the families, the power of initiative to call for that and to make their representations, but allow the government to decide the precise configuration of it. I listened very carefully to what my right honourable friend said about the compulsion of evidence. I think, as I said before, very happy to engage with her and other honourable members as this comes forward. The piece that we need to reconcile, and I take her point that there may not be an inquiry set up, but where there is, making sure that we do not have conflicting powers. But again, I'm very happy on the detail of this and on the clauses in due course to work with the right honourable lady.
Maria Reid.
I welcome the fact that the government wants to legislate for a public advocate after 5 years after the consultation that they undertook closed. But I am very disappointed with the provisions as he set them out. Now, his proposed public advocate wouldn't be independent, it wouldn't be a data controller, it would not be able to act only at the behest of families, it would be directed by the Secretary of State, it wouldn't have the power to appoint independent panels, such as the Hillsborough Independent Panel, but at a much earlier stage following a disaster than the 23 years it took us to get that report out. And it wouldn't have the power to use transparency to get at the truth at an early stage and torpedo the cover-ups that public authorities set about undertaking in the aftermath of disasters. This must be something that the families themselves can initiate, that they can use to get at the truth at an early stage. The fact that the public advocate would have the power to compel, to produce documentation, to shine the light of transparency on what public authorities have done in the immediate aftermath of a disaster would stop cover-ups. It would mean that you wouldn't have 34 years later people still having to find out and fight to get at the truth. That is the prize within our grasp if we set this up right, Madam Deputy Speaker. So does he accept that he'll be missing an opportunity, an important opportunity to stop things going wrong for families if he doesn't beef up his proposals significantly? I can tell him, for what it's worth, I'm perfectly willing to indicate to him in detail quite how they ought to be improved.
I thank the Honourable Lady, and I know she's worked very tirelessly, and we've had right Honourable Lady, and we've had very good engagement on this, and I'm happy for that to continue. I take her point about the power of initiative. The families, the bereaved, will have a power of initiative through consultation, but in the last analysis, particularly if there's conflicting views, and I've seen that before firsthand, the government will have to reconcile those. And secondly, on this data point, I think the problem, and I'm happy to keep listening and working with on this, the problem is going to be if you have an inquiry which has powers to compel evidence of its own, how you reconcile those where they're competing in a process. But as I said, it is important to bring this forward. There's going to be full scrutiny on this, and as I said, as we develop the clauses, I'm very happy to keep working with the Honourable Lady, the right Honourable Lady.
Chair of the Justice Select Committee, Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I pay tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Garston and Halewood for the work that she has done as a fellow member of the Justice Select Committee, and to my right honourable friend, the former Prime Minister. The former Prime Minister's point is an important one, about the risk of cover-ups by those in authority. And that's why, whilst I very much welcome what the Secretary of State has said, it's an important step forward. I hope when engaging as to how best we refine and advance these proposals, you look again at the Justice Select Committee's recommendation that there should be an extension of legal aid availability, although already improved. We should be extending non-means tested legal aid to all cases where there are mass fatalities or where public bodies are potentially at fault. Because it's not fair, there's no equality of arms when those public bodies are represented by teams of lawyers, but the bereaved families have to rely upon sometimes getting legal aid, sometimes not, or pro bono representation. Equality of arms would surely mean representation in those cases as a matter of right.
Can I thank the Chair of the Select Committee? I think this will create a stronger advocacy on behalf of the bereaved and the victims and the families, and having the panels with the expertise, the range, and frankly the status will go a long way to getting the answers. I understand again the point around compulsion of evidence. It's not a theological objection to it, certainly as far as I'm concerned. It's a question of reconciling competing powers when inquiry is set up. I will of course look at the Justice Select Committee's report and recommendations on this. I think just on inquiries in general, of course, they're not supposed to be adversarial, which is why the rules in relation to legal aid are as they are. But we will look and work with colleagues on all sides of the House as we bring forward these important causes.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's acknowledgement that we need an independent public advocate into legislation, but I'm really sorry this announcement today is a pale imitation of what Hillsborough families and survivors spent years campaigning on. The government's proposal feels like a signposting service, a weak signposting service, doesn't have any powers that a truly independent public advocate would require. It feels so weak. So for me, the key question is, would this proposal have stopped the state cover-ups of Hillsborough, contaminated blood scandal, and so many other cover-ups over the ages? And will it prevent further cover-ups? Unfortunately, I've got to say no. So will he instead adopt my honourable friend, the member for Garston Halewood's bill that is ready to go, and work with us to bring the Hillsborough law, including a fully independent public advocate, into legislation?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman and pay tribute to all his efforts. I'm afraid I don't accept the characterisation. Calling it a signposting service is quite wrong. By the way, the signposting is important, but it is the start, not the end, of the role of the IPA. It will be set up as a statutory advocate for all of those who have been affected, whether they're individual victims or on behalf of the community as a whole. It will, as of its own status, be very impossible to ignore. On the specific functions beyond the ones that I set out in my statement, I'm very happy to keep engaging, but I think honourable members need to think about the practicalities, for example, with data compulsion, and how we make sure that they can be reconciled. But I hope that we'll be able to continue working together to make sure that victims and the bereaved, particularly of pre-existing tragedies like Hillsborough, but also those in the future, feel that they're better equipped to get the answers they need and the accountability they need.
Edward Timpson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I join other members in welcoming today's statement and the important step forward that it brings, as well as recognising that the legislative process that is to follow will provide opportunities to look to strengthen the role and ensure it delivers what we set out all the way back in 2017, not least trying to ensure that we can safeguard the independence of the IPA from government. But can I ask my right honourable friend, in relation to survivors and how that will be defined through this new role, whether that will simply be those who have had a life-changing injury, or whether it will also include those who may have been physically or mentally changed by their experience of a disaster they've been involved with, and their need to have support and advice through that inquiry process.
Can I thank my honourable friend? We'll work very closely with him and colleagues on the definition. I think it's important to get that right. And it will be an independent advocate once it's established. with the full force of expression and advocacy to get the answers that are required. But I'm, as I said before, very happy to work with colleagues to make sure that we get the right balance and in particular get it to be as effective as possible, whether it's in relation to an inquiry, statute or otherwise, or indeed when an inquiry is not established.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for coming to the House today and the willingness to legislate in this area. But I think, as he's heard already today, nothing less than an independent public advocate that is acting at the behest of families, not directed by the Secretary of State and with specific powers, will do. Can I ask him, how is he engaging with honourable members in this place, others who have campaigned on these issues for years, and most importantly, the Hillsborough families? My constituent, Deanna Matthews, wrote to me her uncle Brian was unlawfully killed at Hillsborough, to share her dismay about the lack of engagement with bereaved families ahead of this. So can he tell me how he is engaging with those concerned?
The Honourable Gentleman. Just to be clear, it will be entirely independent once it's established, so it's not accurate, the characterisation. In terms of engagement, I'm caught a little bit between the strictures of the Speaker in terms of making announcements to this place first, in terms of the detail, but I wrote to the families and the bereaved and the various different groups, Hillsborough, Grenfell, the Manchester bombings. So they've had advance sight, but of course one of the concerns now is the lack of detail, which of course I couldn't provide in advance of the statement. But I did consult Bishop James Jones, and indeed I saw him over the last week, and I'm very committed to working with all of those families, and I know the Grenfell United and some of those well from my time as Housing Minister, to make sure that we get this right, and above all, the most effective means of giving them the transparency and the accountability they need.
Rob Butler.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I warmly welcome this announcement by the Government of the establishment of an independent public advocate, and also pay tribute to the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Garston and Hellwood, with whom I sat on the Justice Select Committee and I know has worked tirelessly on this for many, many years. Madam Deputy Speaker, I was at university at the time of the Hillsborough disaster in Sheffield. Sadly, a friend of mine died in that tragedy, and so I know all too well the frustration that the bereaved families have felt ever since. Can my right honourable friend tell us in a little bit more detail how he will ensure that the families of the bereaved of the Hillsborough disaster will be fully involved in the practicalities of the establishment of the advocate?
I thank my honourable friend, and I'm very sorry for his loss in relation to Hillsborough. I mentioned some of the engagement. I've offered to meet with the families and the groups, not just of Hillsborough, but in relation to Grenfell and the Manchester Arena bombings. I've always found in these cases where you're facing the bereaved or the survivors of such a dire tragedy, that the most important thing is that they feel that they've got access, and I'm very happy to, as I said, to meet with any of them.
Alison McGovern.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I share the view of my friend, the member for Garston and Hellwood, and I just wonder if the Secretary of State has actually read the Hansard of previous debates on this issue, because 12 years and 5 months ago, the member for Halton, the member for Garston and Hellwood, and many other members of this House and I stood here in order to have the power to compel the government to release papers on Hillsborough and to get transparency over that information. And yet, all that time later, here we are again, still debating who has the power to compel information. In other words, Madam Deputy Speaker, how we as citizens can have the power to get to the truth. I also want to ask the Secretary of State about the duty of candour and extending that to public servants so that they have to proactively tell the truth. Because without this information, we will, as the member for Garston and Hellwood have said, we will always be liable to these cover-ups. I saw it through all of this process with Hillsborough, with Lacanal House, with Grenfell. with the COVID inquiry, again and again and again. And I want the Secretary of State to understand this issue properly. It's about the truth. So will he explain what he's going to do on duty of candour?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? And I know she cares about this subject deeply. I am familiar with these challenges from my time as Housing Minister, aside from the issue of Hillsborough, which I followed closely. On the issue of the duty of candour, I totally understand the importance of that, and I've never said that the IPA is the whole picture. I said it's a partial but an important step that we take, and better to get on with it, because I think after so long, one thing I get from the communities and the victims and the survivors is the need to get on with tangible action. That's the way we'll restore confidence. But the duty of candour is something that was included in the report by Bishop James Jones, and therefore it is right that that is part of the response that the Home Office brings. And I know has previously been set out, they will publish that response in the spring, and of course it will cover that issue.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will my right honourable friend explain in a little more detail at what point and under what circumstances the availability of the advocate will be triggered? I see that he can be involved in not just inquiries but also inquests. So how large a tragedy does it have to be before the victims bereaved can call upon his or her services?
Can I thank the Chair of the Select Committee, my honourable friend. He raised a very good point. The principle is that it's there for major tragedies. This is a specific institution set up with a range of expertise designed to deal with that. And so it's not dealing with one loss of life or a smaller event like that. And I think on the definition we'll need to work very closely with honourable members to get that right. Well, there are so many good things in the Right Honourable Lady's Private Members Bill, but I think there's more actually that we can do than just that. And there are some areas where, as she knows from her engagement with me, and we talked about this at some length, whilst I'm always happy to continue engaging, we take a different view. But the most important thing, and I think my honourable friend has made this point very well, is to make sure it's as effective as possible. I'm committed to that, and I'm committed to working with honourable members on all sides.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, as you know, I was at the Hillsborough disaster, and along with my honourable friend, the member for Garston and Hale Wood, we worked very, very closely with the families, particularly in the lead-up and deciding of the independent panel. So we do know quite a bit about the impact on families and what families want and victims. So I came here today when I saw the heading, Madam Deputy Speaker, saying it's an independent public advocate. What I'm going away from today, Madam Deputy Speaker, is I'm not sure what independent means. Because the government hasn't set out clearly how independence will be. It appears to me from what the Secretary of State has said, that actually it won't be totally independent. And I am surprised, given that there's been so much discussion in this chamber, and my honourable friend and member for Halewood and Garston and Hale Wood. So there's been plenty of discussion, but the Secretary of State's come here today, and I think it's a bit muddled. What is independence he means? Because if it's truly independent, it means it's independent, and ministers have no role in that whatsoever.
To be clear, on the right of initiative, which I know the Right Honourable Lady has raised and included in her bill, that is something where, because you could get different views as to the shape or the scope, that is something that the government will have to ultimately have the last word on. But frankly, what he said about it not being independent is wholly wrong, and we ought to be very clear. From its point of establishment in relation to a tragedy, it will be wholly and entirely independent to serve the victims, the bereaved, the survivors, and only them. I couldn't be clearer on the subject.
Kevin Foster.
Madam Deputy Speaker, a lot of this statement is very welcome and hoping to balance the position for families and victims, not least when they had the unedifying sight of actually those phalanxes of lawyers they were facing, knowing they were actually being paid for by their own taxes and by public funds to sometimes cover up the impact on their relatives. I must say, I don't find myself particularly persuaded on the points he's made around the compulsion of evidence, which would strike me as something that does need to be part of this. But in terms of his preparation work, which he referred to, what is the timeline he has set for that preparation work in terms of this institution being up and ready, pending the legislation coming through this House?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman? He makes a good point. The policy work is quite far developed, but of course we haven't foreclosed options in order that we can have maximum transparency and proper engagement. I need to identify the right legislative vehicle, and then it will take as long as the House takes to enact it. But I hope to say more on the legislative vehicle very shortly.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Can I just put to the Secretary of State that in the case of the contaminated blood scandal, governments failed to acknowledge what had actually happened for decades. Even though thousands of people had been harmed and died, and it's now recognised as one of the worst treatment disasters in the history of the NHS. So how would this independent public advocate work in the circumstances where incidents happen over many years, across many parts of the United Kingdom, and when governments fail to come clean about the involvement of the state for years and deny there was a problem? So what confidence would victims actually have in a system where the government decide whether an independent public advocate was appointed?
So can I, first of all, we're talking about the final configuration of the IPA, and the decision to the immediate consultation will take place with the families and with the bereaved. In relation to how it would help in a scenario like that, that is precisely why, and with the greatest respect to the Right Honourable Lady, we went for a panel approach so that we had the range of experts, because a disaster like that would be quite different from, say, Hillsborough or Grenfell, and therefore it's important that the IPA has the range of expertise. And quite frankly, the minute an IPA is established, the questions that it asks, and I take the point about compulsion of data and evidence, and that's something I'm very happy to keep looking at. But from the moment an independent public advocate started asking those questions, I think, given the nature of its status in the statute, you would break down many of the barriers that previously have faced victims in these situations.
Andy Carter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I agree fully with my right honourable friend when he says getting the detail right is vital in this process. And I'm very pleased with the tone he's taken in some of the comments he's made, that he is willing to work with members from across the House to reach the right settlement for victims, to ensure that this process is right for the future. I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about the panel that he plans, and in particular, will victims be able to be fully represented? Can they elect people to go onto this panel to advocate for people involved in a tragedy?
Can I thank my honourable friend? He's right. The point of having a range of expertise on the panels rather than a single public advocate is precisely to ensure that you've got the range of expertise to deal with the nature of the tragedy that is unfolding, but also to allow the victims, the bereaved, the families to be able to be properly consulted. In addition, they will have the ability to nominate, if you like, a community level representative on that panel, to make sure that, as well as dealing with technical issues, to make sure that, as well as individuals being represented, the community as a whole and the community concerns often expressed as a whole are properly reflected in that advocacy.
Margaret Greenwood.
Deputy Speaker, I'd like to pay tribute to the Hillsborough families and all of those affected for their tireless campaign over decades to establish the truth of what happened, and their determination to make sure that families do not have to suffer the injustices that they've been forced to endure. And I would pay tribute in particular to the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead and for Garston Halewood for all of their hard work on this. The Minister's talking about a conflict between the IPA and any inquiry. But surely he must recognise that it is vital that victims and families can feel confident that they have a truly independent advocate. And surely he must recognise too that by definition you can't have too much transparency.
I certainly agree with the thrust of that, and it will be fully independent once it's established, and with all the powers of advocacy and the expertise to give voice and expression to the victims and the bereaved. I do think, though, on this issue of compulsion of data or access to evidence, that we need to make sure that we are reconciling that with what an inquiry might be, what powers an inquiry might be exercising, and make sure that we don't end up with either a legal muddle or an ineffective process.
Dr. Kieran Mullen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also want to join colleagues in paying tribute to my fellow member of the Justice Select Committee, Member for Garston and Hayward, for her long campaigning on this issue, which I think the whole House recognises. I am interested in this issue of legal representation that other members of the House have raised. How would the IPA interact and what support might be there in terms of accessing legal advice when, as others have said, you potentially facing public bodies with very well-funded legal teams that you as the family and members won't necessarily have access to?
Yeah, can I thank the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend? He makes an important point. In general, inquests should be inquisitorial, fact-finding processes, and the 2019 review into legal aid, which you may recall for inquests, underlined the importance that we keep it that way. There are, of course, circumstances, for example, Article 2 inquests, or where there's a significant public interest in the outcome, where legal representation may be available under the exceptional case funding, and I mentioned a little bit more about the detail of how that would work in my statement.
Whitley.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In order for bereaved families to have confidence in an independent public advocate, then it needs to be truly independence of governments. That means acting on the directions of families and not the Secretary of State, exercising the powers of a data controller and being empowered to establish independent panels. Elkin Abrahamson, the co-author of the Hillsborough Law, has said that this government's engagement with the Hillsborough family has been almost non-existent, and it shows. Will the Justice Secretary now commit to meeting with the Hillsborough families with a view to revising these proposals and bringing them into line with what the Hillsborough families have been calling for so long?
Well, gentlemen, and as I've already made clear, the level of engagement we've had before, and of course I'm very willing to meet with representatives or indeed directly with the families involved.
Fed.
Speaker, I understand that the Secretary of State couldn't divulge to those families who've been campaigning the detail of his announcement today. But does he believe that they would recognise what he's announced today as what they've been campaigning for on behalf of the people they lost, in terms of an independent advocate? And would they recognise what he's announced today as what they've been campaigning for?
Gentlemen, I hope they would, particularly as they engage and we engage on the detail. As I said, it will be fully independent. I take the points about right of initiative and powers over data. We're always willing to look at the detail of how that will work, but actually what we want to do is make sure we have the most effective means of giving expression of voice to them in their time of need.
Emma Lilbuck.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Chloe Rutherford and Liam Curry from South Shields were tragically murdered in the Manchester Arena terror attack. Archaic law in relation to terror attacks prevents their parents registering their precious children's deaths. Last week, they again met with ministers, who this time treated them with contempt, patronised and insulted them. In that meeting, it became clear they have been misled by the government for nearly a year, and that this law can be changed, but the government simply chooses not to. Registration is now imminent. The IPA won't help them or other families. How on earth can they believe the Secretary of State when he says victims and the bereaved are at the heart of his response?
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady, I think if she looks at what we're doing in the round, she can see the steps that we're taking. I'm very mindful and sensitive to the issues that she described, and indeed the constituents that lost their lives in that appalling attack. The Births and Deaths Registration Act is owned, as you'll know, by the Home Office, and the Coroners and Justice Act of 2009. They set out the process for registering deaths following an inquest, which required the coroner to inform the register with particulars of the deceased. There isn't, in the way the law is currently configured, any flexibility around this, but again, I reiterate my deepest sympathies to the families who were so tragically bereaved.
I thank the